and welcome to the Watcher's review of Earthshock, a story that reintroduces the Cybermen after a 7-year absence, a reminder of the dangerous life a companion of the Doctor's lives. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so you can be alerted to more content. Materialising in a cave on Earth in the 24th century, the TARDIS crew, an archaeologist and some troopers uncover a bomb capable of destroying the planet. After deactivating it, the Doctor's curiosity to locating those responsible for planting the bomb brings him into contact with one of his oldest adversaries. Earthshock was the penultimate story of Peter Davison's debut season as the Fifth Doctor. This followed a season of transition that was Tom Baker's final season and ushered the show into the 1980s with producer John Nathan Turner at the helm, and continued with the shift in tones and ideologies when the Fifth Doctor's era was brought in. With his predecessor lasting 7 years and bringing about peak popularity, it was essential that Davison brought something different to the character of the Doctor, whilst also keeping the retention of the audience and attracting new audiences simultaneously. In comparison, where the Fourth Doctor is very alien-like, flippant, but yet full of authority, the Fifth Doctor is youthful, more human in persona, but visibly carrying a sense of fallibility compared to previous incarnations that brought doubt in his decision-making and would cast a shadow of doubt over his tenure that was further exposed in the darker tone storylines, and Earthshock was no exception. Nevertheless, he was still the Doctor and fought on the behalf of good, while still maintaining an interest in science and exploration. In Earthshock, we are introduced to the Doctor in an argument with Adric over the complications of his companion's desire to return to his home world. To give himself the opportunity to calm down and have some space from Adric, the Doctor materialises the TARDIS in a cave in the 24th century. At this point, we are presented with some foreshadowing in the story, when Nyssa comes about some fossils, and he goes about explaining the dinosaurs and how their extinction came about. Before too long, the Doctor, Nyssa and Tegan cross paths with Lieutenant Scott and his troopers, the archaeologist Professor Kyle, who raised the alarm when her co-workers vanished in the cave. Immediately accused of being the murderers, Scott forces the trio to remove a rockfall where they are accused of hiding the bodies. This alerts the true culprits, 2 androids, as the rockfall was put in place to hide a bomb they were protecting. The Doctor immediately gains favour with Scott and Kyle by advising them on how to take out the androids before successfully disarming the bomb. The Doctor's curiosity into wanting to know who planted the bomb takes himself, the TARDIS crew, Professor Kyle, Scott and his surviving troopers to a freighter in deep space. Having made amends with Adric, the pair explore the freighter before being caught by the officer Ringway, who, like Scott, accuses the Doctor of murdering crew members. Whilst on the bridge, being interrogated by the freighter captain Briggs, the freighter starts losing power before realising that the Cybermen are the instigators behind the bomb, as well as the attack on the freighter, before taking it over and setting it on a collision course for the Earth. Unlike his predecessor, the Fourth Doctor, who you'd feel would find a way to sabotage the Cybermen's plans and save the day, the Doctor finds himself in a situation of helplessness, and for once, his adversaries hold all the advantages. He is forced by the Cyber leader to leave Adric on the freighter with the survivors and go back to the TARDIS, where he will be forced to watch the devastation. And although the Cybermen's plans are ultimately thwarted, this is down to Adric. The Doctor eventually manages to overpower and kill the Cyber leader with the help of Nyssa and Tegan by clogging its breathing systems from Adric's gold badge, but is still left to watch the freighter crash, killing Adric on board. In all, the set of circumstances in Earthshock and how the Doctor reacts is unique to his 5th incarnation. His fallibility in bringing Adric along with him to inspect the freighter could be argued as the move that ultimately puts Adric's life in danger. Whilst it isn't the first time the Doctor has brought a companion into a dangerous situation, this is a reminder of the scope of the danger that is presented, only this time the Doctor isn't able to protect his companion. Given the falling out they had at the start, the story concludes with a look of sadness and guilt on the Doctor's face, and realising of not being able to save Adric. This would seemingly cast a form of doubt over the Fifth Doctor for the rest of his tenure, even up to his eventual regeneration at the conclusion of the Caves of Androzani, when his final word is Adric when seeing an apparition of him. This, though, brings a degree of humility to the Fifth Doctor, and gives the audience a sense of relatability in that we can all make wrong decisions or be unable to prevent something from occurring, yet still carry the burden. Sometimes the Doctor doesn't always get things right. Adric is the young teenage companion from the Pocket Universe E-Space and joined the TARDIS crew when stowing away at the conclusion of the Fourth Doctor story, Full Circle. A genius in mathematics, the Fourth Doctor took him under his wing and treated him as a sort of apprentice, having teaching him in the range of things, in particular, knowledge of operating, or at least partly operating, the TARDIS. All this changed following the Doctor's regeneration, and with Tegan and Nyssa also joined on the TARDIS team, the time the Doctor and Adric spent together became diminished. Coupled with his arrogant attitude or the feeling he knows better, Adric at times became the outsider of the TARDIS team. This brings us to the beginning of Earthshock, where he's engaged in an argument with the Doctor over him no longer feeling like part of the team and wanting to return home. The Doctor reminds him that it's dangerous, risky, and maybe impossible to take the TARDIS back to E-Space, but Adric feels he has the mathematical skills to plot the coordinates and goes about working this out while on his own in the TARDIS, and the others are in the cave. He eventually leaves the TARDIS and acts as a distraction and partially damaging an android, allowing them to be destroyed by the troopers. He then assists the Doctor in disarming the bomb. Upon helping the Doctor, the pair reconcile, with the Doctor becoming warmer in the idea of helping Adric go home. Adric reveals that he has already plotted a course, but admits that he doesn't really want to go home, as there is nothing left for him there, and he was merely trying to make a point. For the remainder of the story, Adric and the Doctor remain side by side whilst on the freighter in scenes reminiscent of the relationship he shared with the Fourth Doctor. He assists the Doctor, Briggs and Berger in holding back the Cybermen's efforts in gaining control of the bridge, although the Cybermen's efforts eventually prevail. Whilst being captive, alongside the Doctor and the two crew members, he answers a question the Doctor put to him earlier in the Cybermen's decision to use a bomb to destroy the Earth, initially with the one in the cave, and secondly with the Cybermen converting the freighter. He concludes that the Earth will be able to defend itself against a missile or an attack from a fleet, but a bomb is less conspicuous, in particular the freighter, as it has been given full clearance to travel to Earth, and therefore can bypass any security checks. Ultimately, the Doctor and Adric are separated, in what will ultimately be the final time they see each other. The scene is structured in the manner of a companion bidding a final farewell to the Doctor, without either character or the audience knowing the permanency of the situation. Whilst Adric, along with Briggs and Berger, are held captive on the bridge, Scott comes to the rescue and kills the Cyberman, allowing Adric to go about disabling the device that the Cybermen have fitted onto the controls of the freighter. Racing against time, he manages to solve 2 of the 3 logic codes that brings the freighter out of warp drive and sends it back in time 65 million years. On the verge of solving the final code, a dying Cyberman destroys the controls, leaving Adric realising his fate and clutching the belt that belongs to his dead brother as the freighter crashes into Earth. Although dying in the crash, his actions fundamentally saved the day, as the freighter, moving back 65 million years, makes it the object that crashed from space and destroying the dinosaurs, meaning his life wasn't in vain, and bringing back the foreshadowing highlighted by Nyssa. When Adric joined the TARDIS crew in Season 18 alongside the Fourth Doctor, Romana and K9, it marked for the first time since Patrick Troughton's debut season that the Doctor is travelling with 3 permanent companions. The team of 3 stayed when Romana and K9 were eventually replaced by Tegan and Nyssa by the end of Season 18 and progressing into Season 19, and although that structure was put in place as support to usher in the Fifth Doctor, it didn't have long-term stability in terms of storyline. Over the course of season 19, the three companions were taken in turns in having reduced and more focused roles in the stories in order not to overload the narrative and allow it to breathe. However, by the time season 18 was coming to a conclusion, the characteristics of the Fifth Doctor had been established, and there was no longer a relevance in having three companions on board the TARDIS, and ultimately one had to go. Since Jamie in the Second Doctor era, permanent male companions who travelled with the Doctor were very rare. As well as Adric being the longest serving companion of the three, it made sense that he was the one to go. Additionally, Adric as a character has always divided the fans, and even to this day, his arrogant persona has made him one of the least favourable companions over the course of the classic series. Earthshock displays both the positive and negative aspects of the characters, with him acting like a spoilt brat in the opening episode, and using his expertise in mathematics to attempt to exert himself against others, including the Doctor. But throughout the remainder of the story, he displays his heroics firstly by attacking an android with a rock, and ultimately doing enough to save the human race at the expense of his own life. Actor Matthew Waterhouse was supposedly initially unhappy with the decision to have Adric killed off, until Peter Davison highlighted that him dying off rather than leaving would stick longer in the memory of the audience, given the rarity of it occurring. Ultimately, he was right, as for better or for worse, the character lives long in the memory of Doctor Who fans, with his death becoming an iconic scene in the series' history. By the time Earthshock was broadcasted, Tegan Javanka had almost spent the equivalent of one season on Doctor Who, having joined in the Fourth Doctor's final story, Logopolis. A feisty yet pessimistic Australian air stewardess who accidentally stumbled into the TARDIS, there had been a loose underlying story arc during season 19, in the Doctor attempting to get her back to Earth in 1981. Since her debut in Logopolis, Tegan had begun forging a close bond with Nyssa, given that they joined the TARDIS crew permanently at the same time, and this progressed more in the beginning of Earthshock, with Nyssa showing her how to do something in the TARDIS console room. Initially, with Nyssa, she acts as a bystander to the Doctor and Adric arguing, but ultimately talks to the Doctor in trying to persuade him to go back to the TARDIS and talk to Adric. She becomes embroiled in the battle with the androids, with her pessimism showing when she thinks they're finished, until the Doctor utters the words, "Braveheart, Tegan." Once the story progresses onto the space freighter, Tegan, along with Nyssa, Professor Kyle, Scott and his troopers, are left on the TARDIS while the Doctor and Adric go out and explore. Unwilling to stay on board the TARDIS, she borrows Professor Kyle's overalls and goes exploring the freighter with Scott and his troopers. Her pessimism shines through again when admitting it to being near impossible and confessing to being a mouth on legs, in her regret in coming along with the troops. They eventually come across and immobilise one of the Cybermen, and Tegan manages to take its gun and kills it permanently. She eventually becomes separated from the troopers and gets captured by a Cyberman, and is brought to the bridge where the Cyber leader uses the Doctor's friendship with her as an example of emotions being a human weakness when he threatens to have her killed. When returning to the TARDIS with the Doctor, the Cyber leader and another Cyberman, her feistiness and distress in seeing the Earth on the verge of getting wiped out causes her to tamper with the TARDIS's controls, which come to no avail. After assisting in killing the Cyber leader and the other Cyberman, she is left to witness the freighter crash with Adric on board from the TARDIS monitor, and upon the realisation of his death, shows emotional distress with Nyssa, knowing that their friend has been killed. Although Tegan doesn't have a large role to play in the story, it still acts as a means to carry on evolving her character, which will go on throughout the majority of the Fifth Doctor era of the show, along with the catchphrases of "mouth on legs" and "Braveheart" becoming repeatedly associated with her character, especially the latter, which were her final words when she finally left the TARDIS at the end of Resurrection of the Daleks, and mentioned again when she appeared in the Doctor's vision prior to his regeneration in the caves of Androzani. As previously mentioned, the three-companion structure in Doctor Who tends to result in one of the companions having a vastly reduced role to play in the story, and with Earthshock, that falls upon Nyssa. Having established her being in the cave with Tegan and the Doctor whilst the troopers attempt to take out their androids, her main contribution is explained to Tegan and Scott the Doctor's theory about the logic of the android's weakness by explaining they will become confused when the troopers refocus their firing on the hatch housing the bomb the androids are protecting, causing confusion in their logic, not knowing if to protect the hatch or self-preservation. Upon travelling to the freighter, Nyssa stays on board the TARDIS for the remainder of the story, initially picking up on the TARDIS console a strong magnetic field, which is the power being diverted to activate Cybermen. From the TARDIS, she tries to dissuade Scott and Tegan leaving to find the Doctor. She eventually comes face to face with the Cybermen in the story's climax when they board the TARDIS with the Doctor and Tegan, and upon Adric's death, she consoles with Tegan over the loss of her friend. Nyssa is a strong companion with a strong scientific background who acts on logic and reason. Unfortunately, this isn't her strongest story, and doesn't evolve her character any further compared to other stories that she features in. Earthshock has a number of important guest characters who are integral to the story at various points, given its two varying location settings. First, you have Lieutenant Scott, who is in charge of leading the troopers into the cave to investigate the disappearance of Professor Kyle's colleagues, and initially holding the Doctor responsible before the androids attack them, which he successfully leads an assault on. Full of aggression and bravado, he later leaves the TARDIS with his troopers and Tegan to find the Doctor on the freighter, and eventually leads another assault, this time on the Cybermen. He finally makes it to the bridge, where he kills the Cybermen, holding Adric, Briggs and Berger captive, allowing them the opportunity to stop the freighter. He ultimately leaves the freighter in an escape pod, with everyone else bar Adric, who slips back on the freighter to try and finish the job. You then have Professor Kyle, who is the sole surviving archaeologist from the dig in the cave, from the android's attack, who alerts Scott and his troopers to the disappearance of her colleagues. She goes back to the caves with the troopers, due to her being the only person who knows the routes around the cave, and later travels on board the TARDIS to the freighter, but ultimately stays on board with Nyssa without participating in the events taken on board the freighter. She is ultimately killed when a Cyberman attempts to get in the TARDIS and shoots her. Although her importance is diminished greatly in the second half of the story, it is her raising the alarm that initially brings Scott and his troopers into the story, and her death serves as an emotional distress for Nyssa, who shares a lot of the screen time with her whilst in the TARDIS. Among the freighter crew, you have Captain Briggs, who is running it from the bridge, and is obsessed with earning her bonus by getting the freighter to Earth on time, which leaves her undeterred by the initial disappearances of the crew and the eventual Cybermen assault on the bridge. Initially, the character was inspired by Sigourney Weaver's character Ripley from the film Alien. This became somewhat forgotten upon the appointment of light entertainment actress Beryl Reid, who admitted to not understanding her dialogue, but nevertheless performs the role with an air of authority. Keeping Briggs in tow is her deputy and technical expert Berger, who, like Briggs, spends the entire story on the bridge. Although being her deputy, she tries to get Briggs to see sense when the Cybermen start attacking the freighter by looking at her instruments. She later works with the Doctor and Adric in helping prevent the Cybermen reach the bridge. Finally, you have the officer Ringway, who is deadbeat and depressed about the disappearance of the crew on the freighter, and is always at the end of criticism from Briggs and Berger. He captures the Doctor and Adric and accuses them of murdering crew members before arming the remaining crew members for a fruitless defence against the Cybermen's assault. All this turns out to be a ruse though, as Ringway turns out to be in league with the Cybermen and holds Briggs, Berger, the Doctor and Adric captive on the bridge. Eventually he is killed by the Cybermen when he is no longer useful. Ringway is a continuation of human characters who align themselves with the Cybermen, such as Eric Klieg from Tomb of the Cybermen, Tobias Vaughan from The Invasion, and Kelman from Revenge of the Cybermen. The only difference with Ringway is that his screen time is greatly reduced compared to other characters who carried out similar roles, but mainly in order to preserve the limitation of his character. Earthshock marks the Cybermen's first appearance in the show since 1975's Revenge of the Cybermen, and only their third full appearance in 14 years, which is surprising given the status they hold amongst Doctor Who antagonists. Given the length of time passed since their last appearance, their look had been greatly updated, with the continuation of the actors playing the Cybermen also providing the voices, which had started back with Revenge of the Cybermen. As a result, Earthshock sees the Cybermen take a great deal more dialogue than they had during a lot of their stories from the 1960s. For a large part of the story, the Cybermen act in the shadows, initially deploying 2 androids to protect the bomb in the caves. The androids themselves carry their own level of sinisterism, with their basic, emotionless design and clad in black, which allows them to operate in the shadows. Additionally, they are mute, and the only noise they make is the signal they emit, which Professor Carl recognises when they start defending the bomb. Although they are a new addition to Cybermen technology, they fundamentally carry out the role that Cybermats had done in previous stories, that being the dirty work of the Cybermen. After the Cybermen are revealed at the end of episode 1, they remain hidden still, whilst plotting their takeover of the freighter, firstly by draining power to activate some of the 15,000 strong army they have hidden in the silos. It is during these scenes the hierarchy of the Cyber Leader, played by David Banks, and the Cyber Lieutenant, played by Mark Hardy, carry the dialogue. Eventually, they make their move to take the bridge of the freighter, having kept their identity hidden that successfully that the majority of the characters only realise their involvement halfway through the 3rd episode. Once they take control of the bridge, the Cyber Leader reveals to the Doctor their plans. Earth is due to play host to a conference that will unite military powers in a war that would ultimately defeat the Cybermen. To prevent this from happening, their original plan was for the bomb in the cave to go off and wipe out the majority of the population of Earth, with the Cybermen then taking over the freighter and activating their army to take out any remaining survivors. With the Doctor deactivating the bomb, the Cybermen then revert to Plan B, which is use their technology to lock the freighter on a collision course with Earth. Given its size and the fact that it is powered by antimatter, it would create an explosion big enough to cause similar damage to the bomb in the cave. With the Cyber Leader having more dialogue than Cybermen in previous stories, he also has a deeper personality, making him sadistic, while still being devoid of emotion, how Cybermen traditionally are. This is firstly highlighted by the Cyber Leader through his gloating of having control over the Doctor by exploiting his emotions as weaknesses by threatening to kill Tegan if his orders are not followed. Also, the Cyber Leader is insistent on keeping Cybermen on the freighter when it crashes to record the emotions and distress displayed by Adric, Briggs and Berger, which will assist their cause in wiping out the remaining survivors on Earth. For the same reasons, he also insists that Tegan watches the events from the TARDIS monitor. The Cybermen featured in Earthshock carry on a lot of the ideologies from Cybermen stories in the past, in particular the ongoing war with humanity, and use of non-Cybermen characters to carry out the foundation work of their plans before making a final advance at the critical moment, and regard being devoid of emotion as an advantage over their human adversaries. However, the additional dialogue of the Cyber Leader adds more depth to the antagonist, and although the leader shows more personality that borders on having emotion to a degree, it's used mainly to have an acknowledgement of it merely increasing their sadism and evil nature for this story. Earthshock was written by Eric Saywood, with this being his 2nd story he had contributed, following the visitation from earlier on in the season. Additionally, for season 19, Saywood also shared script editing duties with Anthony Root. Earthshock came about when another story was dropped from the schedule, and as a result, Saywood and producer John Nathan Turner saw this as the perfect opportunity to bring the Cybermen back to the show. As both a writer and script editor, Eric Saywood had a tendency to include dark and violent undertones to some of the stories he had a hand in constructing, with varying degrees of success. This was hinted at in his debut story, The Visitation, but with Earthshock, the story takes these dark and violent themes to a level not really seen on the show since the days of Philip Hinchcliffe in the mid-70s. However, Saywood uses it here for a reason and not just shock value. For a 4-episode story, Earthshock features a large cast with meaningful characters containing dialogue, as previously mentioned earlier on. Due to this, Saywood had to find efficient methods of eliminating the characters so they wouldn't choke up the narrative, and for the most part, this meant killing them off. During the cave scenes in the first episode, you are presented with a good portion of troopers having speaking roles. In addition to Professor Kyle and Lieutenant Scott, you have Snyder, Mitchell, Baines, Walters, as well as 3 other troopers having speaking parts. Before the end of the first episode, 6 of these characters have been killed off by the Cybermen's androids, and although their death is implied on the monitor that Walters is watching, the effect is shown with them being shown in person in one scene, disappearing off the monitor in the next scene, before their remains being presented as melted slime with all of their main badges surviving and the androids standing over. Complete with a dark and shadowy setting, this sets the tone of drama, tension and fear factor for the rest of the story before the audience are even aware of the Cybermen being in it. This would later carry on in the story with the systematic destroying of the androids, several Cybermen, the entire freighter crew with the exception of Briggs and Berger, majority of Scott's troops, Professor Kyle, and of course not forgetting, Adric. Saywood elects to go for a non-complicated narrative, which boils down to just the Cybermen trying to attack the Earth twice over. With the removal of complex plot points, Saywood is able to drive the narrative by the action, reducing the need for heavy dialogue or additional scenes to explain a potentially more complicated plot. Despite this method brought about by Saywood's script writing, he still resorts to tried and tested story methods in Earthshock, in particular the base under siege scenario, which was heavily used during the Patrick Troughton era, and something that fitted in well with the Cybermen stories of the past, and it heavily sets up the part of the story to take place on the freighter. When John Nathan Turner took over as producer back in 1980, he came in with a new Bruin philosophy, making the biggest wholesale changes in one go the show had ever seen, from music, titles, and even the actor, all to bring it up to date and in tune with the 1980s. With these changes, John Nathan Turner wanted to bring in newer, younger audiences, but he also didn't want to isolate the long-term viewers. Although bringing the Cybermen back was one method, John Nathan Turner also liked to fill in a lot of the stories with self-referencing to the show's past. Eric Saywood cleverly writes this in during the second episode when the Cybermen look back on the android's viewing footage and notice the TARDIS, causing them to look back on previous adventures and the Doctor's previous incarnations, with William Hartnell in The 10th Planet, Patrick Troughton in Tomb of the Cybermen, and Tom Baker in Revenge of the Cybermen, John Pertwee being absent due to his incarnation at the time not coming across the Cybermen. What this does is simultaneously involves the older fans with memories of previous stories in the days before VHS and DVD, as well as bringing newer fans up to speed with the Doctor-Cybermen relationship through the show's history. This kind of flashback tactic would be reused on numerous occasions during John Nathan Turner's tenure as producer. Earthshock was directed by Peter Grimwade, who is on his 4th and final story, having previously taken the helm with Full Circle, Logopolis and Kinder. Prior to this, he was a production assistant on several stories during the 1970s. During that time, you can see that he picked up technical aspects of directing from other directors with the way he directs Earthshock. Firstly, he adapts the method of quick cuts and multiple camera angles to give the story a constant, fast-paced feel, although when it came to the actual filming, this would have taken longer than usual due to the constant repositioning of the cameras. An additional method of shooting Grimwade used was low-angle shooting techniques when filming the Cybermen to give them more screen dominance and a greater sense of power and threat. Grimwade also directed from the studio floor as opposed from the control room, which was an unusual approach at the time. Due to this, he would have a closer interaction with the actors, and was notorious for his impatience and tendency to push actors more to get the desired outcome he set about achieving. Despite this, both the cast and Grimwade had a positive reaction to the filming of Earthshock. In order to maintain the surprise elements of Earthshock, John Nathan Turner undertook several tactics to maintain the Cybermen's return. Firstly, the title itself, having realised that in the past the show would place the antagonist in the title to remove the suspense of who the villain actually was. Secondly, he took measures to ban the public attending the viewing gallery during the studio recording, so that no one would get a preview knowing the Cybermen had returned. Finally was the cancellation of a Radio Times photo shoot for the story, as well as removing all mention of Cybermen from the cast list for episode 1, creating a greater audience reaction once they were revealed and the first episode cliffhanger. John Nathan Turner also took the unusual method of silent credits at the conclusion of episode 4 in reaction to Adric's death, with the credits rolling over Adric's broken star badge. This was inspired by the death of Martha Longhurst in the soap Coronation Street in 1964, which was also a shock twist. To this day, the use of the silent credits divides fans, with some saying the silent credits were too cheesy, whilst others thought it created dramatic effect. Filming for Earthshock took place almost entirely at BBC Television Centre Studios, the exception of the opening of episode 1, with the troopers and Kyle entering the cave, with that taking place at Sprinwell Quarry in Hertfordshire, and didn't feature any of the main cast or the Cybermen. Production design was carried out by Bernard Lloyd Jones on his only contribution to the show. To fit in with the dark tone of the story, Lloyd Jones adopts a dark, shadowy look to both the caves and the freighter. This allowed a minimalist approach to actual design work, in particular with the freighter, which is merely comprising of dark corridors and silos and stairs and steps comprising of scaffolding, which would reduce the cost levels down much. This approach is seemingly inspired by the film Alien and marks a change in approach from ships, freighters and space stations in the show previously being brightly lit and often leaving a dated look, but the look of a basic and dimly lit freighter indicates that this is a vast storage facility and doesn't really need over-lighting. As previously mentioned, due to the period of time since the Cybermen's last appearance, a revamp in their look was required, which is something that wasn't new to them, but every redesign previously reflected the period of when the stories were filmed. The 80s redesign fell upon Dinah Collin, who based the costume around a pilot suit, which was painted silver, complete with apparatus attached to the chest area. The head kept to the basic design of hollowed-out eyes and pipes running into the head, with the cyber leaders having black pipes as opposed to silver to establish their hierarchy. The most obvious new feature is the design work on the mouthpiece, which in the past had either been hollowed out or just a simple piece that opened when the Cybermen spoke. Here we have a chin-shaped piece of perspex, with the actor's actual chin and mouth painted silver and their teeth blacked out. Naturally, when the actor spoke their lines, the mouth would naturally move. This design acts as a reminder that deep inside every Cyberman there is still an organic life form from when they were still human. Music for Earthshock was provided by Malcolm Clarke, who was working on the show for the first time since 1972's The Sea Devils. Keeping in theme with the show's synthesized approach to the soundtrack, Clarke built his music around what would become his trademark bass notes that would replicate the tempo to the Cybermen's march. On top of this, he implies industrial-like sounds and metal clanging to replicate the feel of the freighter and the Cybermen. Through all this, he builds a theme for the Cybermen in the manner that they had in the 60s. Overall, atmospheric and like the set design, fitting with the dark nature of the story, Clarke would reuse some of this soundtrack 3 years later in Attack of the Cybermen. Earthshock was broadcasted across 4 episodes from the 8th to the 16th of March 1982. John Nathan Turner took a lot of gambles in getting a response in viewer ratings and audience reaction, and it ultimately paid off, with the story averaging 9.5 million viewers per episode. And although it wasn't the most viewed story of the season, it marked the only time during John Nathan Turner's era of producing the show that all the episodes were amongst the top 50 most watched programmes of the week. This was actually quite a feat, given that the show at the time was broadcasted on a Monday and Tuesday, as opposed to the Saturday night slot it traditionally held. In my opinion, I also feel the gambles pay off in the quality of the story as well. The first episode is one of the best opening episodes in the series history, by creating tension-filled atmosphere and the shock revelation of the Cybermen showing up at the end. This successfully carries the rest of the story and is one of the few stories that I feel is well written, well acted and well produced. The shock factors of the Cybermen returning and Adric's death leave a lasting memory of the audience, and as such it has remained one of the most talked about and memorable stories of the classic era. With the exception of the 20th anniversary special, The Five Doctors, the three companion structure would only be used a handful of times, and all of them in the Fifth Doctor era, with Mordrin Undead, which featured Tegan, Nyssa and debut in Turlough, the following story Terminus, which featured Nyssa's departure, The King's Demons, which featured Tegan, Turlough and the robot Chameleon, and Planet of Fire, which introduced Perry as well as acting as a departure for Turlough and Chameleon. As for the Cybermen themselves, their new design will remain largely the same for the rest of the stories that they featured in during the 80s, with actor David Banks reprising the role of the Cyber Leader in all of them. However, none of the stories featured the same impact as Earthshock in regard to the storyline and usage of the Cybermen, and as such, this is their strongest story of the 1980s, and stands up alongside their better stories from the 1960s. The dark and violent undertones would carry on through the Fifth Doctor era and into the Sixth Doctor era, where it was argued that it was pushed too far. Both of these eras ran with Eric Saward as script editor, whilst he also wrote the stories Resurrection of the Daleks, co-writing Attack of the Cybermen under a pseudonym, and Revelation of the Daleks. Peter Grimwade would move on from directing to writing for Doctor Who, providing 3 stories all in the Fifth Doctor era, starting with the story that followed Earthshock, Time Flight. So, that concludes my review of Earthshock. Of course, it is only my opinion, so feel free to express your own in the comments if you think differently. Be sure to tune in for my next video, but if you do have a suggestion for a story for me to review, then just let me know. But remember, it's the end, but the moment has been prepared for.